Nigel loved being a nail. He couldn't wait to get hammered. From the moment he came out of the steel furnace, he knew what he wanted to be. No girder for him, no skyscraper, suspension bridge, high-speed train or bucket. The best thing a piece of steel could be was a nail. Billions of years ago, he was part of a meteorite that smashed into the earth, scattering some of his atoms and other bits of iron ore across an area that is now mostly South Wales. In 1932, the land around him was rocked by a controlled explosion, and he was finally extracted from his eternal home. There followed the complicated process of turning him from iron into steel at the Ebbw Vale Steelworks near Abergavenny. First, he and the rock around him was crushed. Then powerful magnets pulled him away from what had been his home since the earth was born. Turned into pellets and mixed with coal, he was heated in a blast furnace until he melted, fused with the coal, and then poured into a tube-shaped mould called a billet. As he cooled, he was pulled and pulled and pulled until he became a thin steel wire. A powerful blade then chopped him into his 6-centimetre length. Other tools sharpened him at one end and beat the other end into a flat head. Then he was poured, along with 399 other round wire nails, into a cardboard box. A week later, he was delivered to a warehouse in Swansea, then taken to Jones, the ironmonger, in the small town of Llandilo, near the Brecon Beacons. There, he and his fellow nails sat on a shelf for nearly 4 years, until his box was bought by a sheep farmer called Jenkins, and placed on a shelf in the farm workshop. Over the years, one by one and sometimes in handfuls, the other nails were taken to do important work around the farm. In 1938, some sheep escaped from their pen, and it took 2 days and the help of most of the village to round them up. 10 nails were used to repair the fence. During the war, the army conducted hundreds of exercises on the Brecon Beacons, and a great deal of damage was done. Many nails got used over those 5 years on gates, hurdles, fences, and the complete rebuild of a shed that had been flattened by a Sherman tank. Buried in the earth for 4 billion years, he had never really got bored. He'd slept most of the time, but this damp box in a Welsh valley was getting him down. Despite being made of steel, he was starting to get a bit rusty, and he worried that in a few thousand years he would be completely useless. The company was rubbish too. They were all hard as nails, and buried as they were at the bottom of the box, had nothing to talk about. The conversation was limited to, "What are you looking at? Think you're hard, do you? And I'll give you 6 inches. He worried that if and when he finally got used, he'd end up as something unremarkable, like banged into a beam to hang a coat on, used to tack down the corner of some curling lino in the farm toilet, or dropped on the floor and thrown into the box of assorted bits of metal that might be useful one day. The greatest fear of any piece of steel. One day in the late 50s, Farmer Jenkins decided the workshop needed a major tidy-up and sort-out. Finding that the cardboard box of round wire screws was damp and rotting, he transferred them into a kilner jar and put them on the top shelf. This was fantastic. Nigel was right on the outside and could, for the first time in his life, see his surroundings. Just nearby was an old Chinese takeaway pot filled with screws, and further along, roll plugs, wood glue, a steel tape measure, baler twine, 2 rolls of duct tape, and a can of WD-40. best of all, he was now with a different group of nails. As they had all got shuffled around when they were poured into the jar, Norbert had been at the top of the box and had been expecting to be used daily for the past 18 months. Now he was halfway down again. "I can't believe it," he cried. 25 years it's taken me to be the next in line, and now this. Neil and Naomi went a month ago. They're holding up a plaque of heroes on the war memorial. Neville was used last week, floorboard duty, and only yesterday that swine Nelson got picked to reinforce the main suspension rod on the Ferguson tractor. I was next. It was my ruddy turn. After introducing himself, Nigel tried to calm him down. He pointed out that they were all billions of years in the making, and a few extra months would pass in a flash. After all, when you get used, you won't have us for company anymore, will you? He had a point. The new group were a lot more friendly, and now they had something to actually talk about. The rugby. Like most Welshmen, Rhys Jenkins loved his rugby. His team were Neath, the Welsh All Blacks, and most Saturdays he'd drive the 30-odd miles to the Knoll ground to watch his beloved boyos. His greatest passion, though, was watching Wales. He could never afford to attend an international match, so every winter he'd sit in front of his telly for the 5, later 6 nations, and every 4 years he would suffer the disappointment of not winning the World Cup. The only problem was that his wife Dilys was a member of a branch of Christianity called the Exclusive Brethren, who, among other beliefs, held that television was the work of the devil, and anyone watching it would be damned for eternity. Farmer Jenkins therefore kept his small black and white telly behind a straw bale in the workshop, and every year would get it out for secret viewings of the rugby, and occasionally the greatest joy in the world for a Welshman of beating the English. So Nigel, Norbert, and the few other nails with a direct line of sight to the telly, Nathaniel, Ned, Nora, Norman, and Nancy, started their passion for the sport, and for 10 years they spoke of little else. On match days, they joined Farmer Jenkins in his running commentaries. "Gareth Edwards sidesteps one, hands off another. It's a try. He's nailed it. Barry John through the middle, passes to Gerald Davis, hammers it home. Duckham on the wing, going for the corner, tackled by Bennett, pins him to the touchline, saves the try. Man of steel." The years went by, and slowly the nails were used up. The old lost head pin that had been used as a hook for the sheep shears in pen number 4 since 1923 finally rusted away and was replaced by Nathaniel. Nora was used to mark up the position for a new light fitting in the farmhouse kitchen, but was then callously thrown away when Jenkins drilled the holes for the roll plugs and screwed the backplate into position. Oh, how they hated screws. Nancy was the first of their box to achieve true greatness. In 1972, Neath won the Welsh Cup, and Nancy became the nail in the clubhouse wall that held the frame photo of Martin Davis holding the cup aloft in triumph. Legend. It was 8 years until the jar was used again. Jenkins came to the workshop less and less, and then one year, unaccountably, missed the whole international rugby season. The nails were in shock. A year later, in February 1980, Norbert said his farewells as Jenkins scrabbled him out of the jar, and he was one of 20 that nailed down Dilys's coffin that Jenkins had made himself, not being able to afford the undertaker's fees. She was buried in Llandilo churchyard on a cold, wet Saturday morning. And that afternoon, Jenkins took the telly out of the workshop and watched the rugby by the fire in the sitting room. Wales won, but the Nails never knew. Finally, in the spring of 1998, Nigel was lifted from the jar with 6 of his mates and put in Jenkins's jacket pocket. A floorboard in the farmhouse had rotted and needed replacing. Jenkins found some old boards and cut one to size. He used a cold chisel to lever out the old board, clawed out the rusted floorboard nails, chiselled out the dirt, placed the new piece into place and started to hammer it down. Nigel was thrilled. The board was in front of the fireplace and within sight of the TV. They'd be warm and watching Wales again. Ned was hammered down securely. Norman went in with just 5 hefty blows. Then it was Nigel's turn. Jenkins hadn't marked the wood and was knocking the nails in by eye. He positioned Nigel at the far end of the plank, opposite Norman. This was it. Bang! The first blow, and he was into the wood. Bang! A second, and he was halfway in. Bang! He didn't move. Bang! Bang! He was getting no deeper in and was starting to bend. He had hit a knot of hard wood at the bottom of the floorboard and could go no further. Bang! 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 He bent in half. With a curse, the farmer reversed the hammer and clawed him out, throwing him to one side. Nigel watched aghast as Jenkins took a nail he didn't recognise from his pocket and started half an inch to the left of his previous attempt, hammered it effortlessly into the plank. Nigel, bent in two, was swept with the sawdust and wood chips into the hearth, where he lay through the hot summer when no fire was lit. Billions of years in the making, a tiny knot of hard wood was his undoing. No glory for Nigel, just the utter shame of failure. As the evenings drew in and the days got shorter, Jenkins cleared out the hearth to light the first fire of the autumn. He watched on the telly as Wales lost heavily to England in a friendly. After the match, Nigel was shovelled up with the ashes, put in a plastic sack and thrown on the back of the old short wheel-based Land Rover with other sacks of waste from the farm. When they got to the dump at Nantycouse, Jenkins hauled the sacks out of the back, but Nigel got caught in a crack in the Land Rover's side panelling and fell out of the bag, which split, causing all the ashes from the fire to spill out everywhere, in the landy and on the pristine floor of the recycling centre. Oh, there was a hell of a row. The recycling staff threatened to fine him. "I'd like to see you try," cried Jenkins. "Come on then, if you think you're hard enough." Which was a brave challenge, given that he was pushing 80 and the 2 young men both played prop for Carmarthen. After a bit, they swept all the ash and waste out of the Land Rover, but Nigel, unseen, had fallen onto the floor on the driver's side. Reluctantly, the 2 men let the farmer go with a stern warning. "We'll let you off this time, Grandad, but don't let that happen again, or there'll be trouble, see?" Jenkins drove away at high speed. He was furious. Bloody kids these days. He didn't know what the world was coming to. And losing to England. Unbearable. He drove at top speed back towards the farm, taking a corner too fast, coming onto the main road, and nearly hitting an articulated truck travelling fast in the opposite direction. Even this didn't slow him. Such was his anger. It was lucky that the old Land Rover only did about 50 top whack, otherwise he'd have been caught by the speed camera on the A48. He turned for home, onto the road to Llanarlli, and raced down the country lane he knew so well. Coming round the corner at the top of the hill, the car skidded on some black ice and began to slalom. He kept control until he got to the bottom of the slope and then lost it on the bridge. And the old Land Rover crashed through the weak wooden barrier into the river Avon Gwynnon below. Jenkins was dazed. The water was rising around him. He knew he had to get out. He scrabbled for the seatbelt release and pressed down, but nothing happened. It wouldn't budge. He tried again. Nothing. He looked down. A shard of wood had stuck in the release mechanism and he couldn't pull it out. He was getting desperate. The water level was up to the window as the car sank deeper into the river. He scrabbled around on the floor for something to lever out the piece of wood. He felt for a piece of metal. It was Nigel. He pushed him hard into the seat release, and at last it broke open. He was free. Sitting by the riverbank, waiting for the rescue service, he held Nigel in his hand. "I reckon you saved my life just then, old fella," he smiled. As a memento of that brush with death, Rhys Jenkins kept Nigel mounted in a wooden frame on the mantelpiece above the fire, in sight of the telly. And when Wales won the Grand Slam in 2005, they were both there to see it and rejoice. Nigel had nailed it after all.